dangerous thing.
Mr. Chair.
Barbara
Mr.
Kuriga.
Chair. Mr. Chair.
I've called Barbara Kuriga.
I move that the question be now put.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
I'm going to hear from Peeni Henare.
Yeah, thank you for this opportunity. Look, I want to draw the House's attention to Part 2, Clause 9, the exercise of powers under Housing Act 1955. And I first turn to the submission made by Te Matapihi, the Māori housing network established under Te Puni Kōkiri, and their submission says, and I agree with this wholeheartedly, it is our position that iwi-led, non-market approach to regeneration with strong government support, I repeat, with strong government support, holds the key to solving Auckland's housing crisis. I turn to Clause 9, sir, and it says the exercises of powers under Housing Act 1955, and it lists there, it says, unless the Housing Act Minister has consulted the following bodies about the proposed development, sir, and it lists the Auckland Council, makes sense to me, the Tāmaki Redevelopment Company Limited, yeah, I guess that makes sense to me, and the Maunga Kia Tāmaki Local Board established under Section 10 of the Local Government Auckland Council Act 2009. Where in there is the strong support from this government for Ngāti Paua, for the mana whenua o Tāmaki Makaurau, if they are serious about allowing iwi-led developments to ease the housing crisis in Tāmaki Makaurau, sir, it would have in that particular clause Ngāti Paua. It would also have in that clause Ngāti Whātua. It would also have in that clause, sir, Ngā mana whenua o Tāmaki Makaurau, allowing a precedence that forces this government, who supposedly supports these initiatives by iwi to solve the housing matters in Tāmaki Makaurau, it forces them to work with them. But it's not doing that in this particular bill, sir. In fact, just as I mentioned earlier, the limited scope by MB in the consultation on this bill, this particular clause, Clause 9, will continue that. It will continue that by only making sure that the Minister has consulted the following bodies: the Auckland Council, the Tāmaki Redevelopment Company Limited, the Maunga Kia Tāmaki Local Board. Where are the iwi in that conversation? Where is this supposed support from this government to allow the iwi, to allow ngā mana whenua o Tāmaki Makaurau to actually have a meaningful part and leadership to play in the housing, in solving the housing crisis in Tāmaki Makaurau? And I want to repeat that submission from Te Matapihi. It is our position that iwi-led non-market approach to regeneration with strong government support holds the key to solving Auckland's housing crisis. I agree with that 100%. And if that is the case, I wonder why I'd ask the Minister, Mr. Chair, if he can get up and explain then, after his contribution previously, why Ngāti Paua, why ngā mana whenua o Tāmaki Makaurau aren't clearly a party that the Minister, under their powers, must consult with. Must consult with. The others are easy to understand. But if this government wants to try and tell us that they're supporting wholeheartedly the iwi engagement in solving and contributing to solve to solutions to the housing crisis, can the Minister please rise to his feet and tell us why they aren't included in Clause 9, sir? I think that's a pretty fair question. If they consider, and Mr. Hudson seems to be in full support of Ngāti Paua, I'd encourage him to make a contribution too and answer why they aren't included in this, to make sure that the Minister's powers can't override them, to make sure that the Minister's powers, they must consult with mana whenua, and in this particular instance, Ngāti Paua, sir, and I'll leave that question for the Minister to consider.
Brett Hudson.
I move that the question be now put.
No, I'm going to hear from Mika Whaiteri because she's on the committee.
Worth a go.
I do, because I'm a member of the Select Committee